The rain had been a promise all afternoon, a dark bruising on the horizon that the weary sun could not burn away. Now, it was a biblical reality, turning the vast, unforgiving plains of the Arizona Territory into a sea of mud and misery. Inside the stagecoach, every jolt and shudder was a reminder to Eleanor Vance of her own inexorable journey. She was cargo, same as the heavy, iron-strapped chest of dowry silver that sat opposite her, a silent testament to the transaction that had defined the last 6 months of her life. She stared out the leather-curtained window, but there was little to see. The world was a watercolor painting left in the downpour, its colors bleeding into a uniform, miserable gray. Red rock formations, proud and sharp in the morning light, were now just weeping silhouettes. The saguaros stood like lonely sentinels, their arms raised in surrender to the heavens. Eleanor felt a kinship with them, alone, silent, rooted to a fate she had not chosen. Beside her, the maidservant, a young woman named Martha, whose nerves were as frayed as the hem of her dress, wrung her hands. "It is a fierce one. Miss Eleanor, a real gully washer. I pray the driver knows the road." Eleanor offered a small, tight smile that did not reach her eyes. "Mr. Thompson has driven this route for 20 years. I am sure he is accustomed to the weather." Her voice was calm, measured, the product of a lifetime of learning to conceal the storms that raged within. Numbness was her shield. A cold, heavy blanket she pulled over her heart. It was better than the terror that lay beneath. She was 19 years old. In 2 days, she would be Mrs. Clayton Gable, wife to a man 30 years her senior, a cattle baron whose name was spoken in whispers from Prescott to Tucson. Some called him powerful, others ruthless. Her father, in a moment of whiskey-fueled honesty, had called him their salvation. The memory surfaced, unbidden, as the coach wheel hit a deep rut, rattling the silver chest and Eleanor's teeth. She closed her eyes, and she was back in her father's study in Philadelphia. The room that had always smelled of leather-bound books and pipe tobacco now reeked of cheap liquor and desperation. The creditor's letters were piled on the mahogany desk like a funeral pyre. Her father, a man who had always stood so straight, was slumped in his chair, his face pale and slack. "Eleanor," he had begun, not meeting her gaze. "Mr. Gable has made a most generous offer." She remembered the way he said the name, Clayton Gable, with a mixture of reverence and fear. He was a name from the West, a place that, to Eleanor, was no more real than the lands in the adventure books she used to read, a place of savages and cowboys and dust. Mr. Gable had visited the city on business the year prior. She had met him once, at a dinner. He had not spoken much, but his eyes, pale and cold as a winter sky, had assessed her the way a man assesses livestock. He had thick, powerful hands, and a stillness about him that was more menacing than any outburst. "He has offered to settle our debts," her father continued, his voice cracking. "All of them. He wishes to take a wife, a woman of good breeding, of refinement, to manage his household." The unspoken words hung in the air between them. Her father's gambling, his foolish investments, the slow, agonizing collapse of the family fortune. He was selling her, not for land or titles, as kings of old had done, but to settle a ledger. She was the last asset he possessed. She had not screamed. She had not wept. She had simply nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Obedience was a virtue that had been hammered into her since birth. You did your duty. You did what was necessary. Love was a luxury, a fantasy for novels. Survival was the only thing that was real. A sudden, violent crack, louder than the thunder, jolted her back to the present. The coach pitched forward with a gut-wrenching lurch, throwing Martha against the silver chest with a cry of pain. Eleanor braced herself against the wall as the world tilted sickeningly. There was a splintering, grinding sound of wood and metal tearing apart. And then they came to a dead, jarring stop, canted at an impossible angle. The door was thrown open, and the driver, Mr. Thompson, a stout man with a face like a weathered map, peered in, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "Axle's busted clean in two. Ma'am, we are stuck fast. Stuck right on the edge of Black Creek Ravine." Eleanor's heart, which had been so still, began to pound against her ribs. Stuck, the word echoed in the small, cramped space. "What are we to do?" Martha whimpered, holding her head. "Mr. Thompson spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. "Nothing for it. I will have to unhitch one of the horses and ride for the next way station. It is a good 10 miles. I will be back with a wagon by morning, God willing." He looked past them, his eyes scanning the bleak landscape. "There is an old barn up on that rise. Belongs to the Double T Ranch, but no one has used it in years. It is dry. At least, you will have to wait there. It is not safe to stay in the coach this close to the ravine." The thought of spending the night in a derelict barn was unnerving, but the thought of the coach sliding into the unseen depths of the ravine beside them was far worse. Eleanor gathered her composure, a general taking command of a mutinous army of fears. "Very well, Mr. Thompson. We will do as you say." He helped them out into the maelstrom. The wind tore at Eleanor's traveling cloak, and the rain was cold and sharp as needles against her face. The ground was a slick, treacherous morass, with Martha leaning on her and Mr. Thompson guiding them. They began the slow, miserable trek up the hill. The barn was a dark, skeletal shape against the angry sky, its roofline sagging in the middle like a broken back. It was even gloomier inside. The air was thick with the scent of old hay, dust, and damp earth. Rain drummed a relentless rhythm on the tin roof. Thin streams of water trickled through cracks in the wooden walls. It was vast and empty, filled with shadows that danced and writhed with every flash of lightning. "You will be safe enough here," Mr. Thompson said, his voice trying for a reassurance it did not possess. He lit a rusty lantern he had carried from the coach, casting a small, flickering pool of yellow light. "I will be back as soon as I can." And then he was gone, the heavy barn door groaning shut behind him, leaving them to the sounds of the storm and the oppressive silence. "We are all alone," Martha whispered, her voice trembling. But she was wrong. From the deepest shadows in the far corner of the barn, a voice spoke, low and rough as gravel. "Not quite." Martha screamed, a thin, terrified sound that was swallowed by a clap of thunder. Eleanor froze, her hand flying to her throat. She peered into the darkness, her eyes straining. A figure slowly emerged from the gloom, stepping into the edge of the lantern's light. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered but lean, dressed in worn, travel-stained clothes. His face was all sharp angles and rough planes, shadowed by a scruff of dark beard and framed by damp hair that hung over his brow. He was not handsome, not in the polished way of the men she knew from Philadelphia. There was a hardness in his face, a history of hard miles and harder fights etched into the lines around his eyes and mouth. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was almost predatory. "Who are you?" Eleanor demanded, her voice shaking only slightly. She pushed Martha behind her, a useless, instinctual gesture of protection. The man's eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue in his weather-beaten face, took them in. He noted Eleanor's fine, though mud-splattered, dress, her carefully coiled hair coming undone in the humidity, the sheer terror in the maid's eyes. His gaze was unnervingly direct, devoid of any deference. "Name is Silas Beckett," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Just taking shelter, same as you." He gestured vaguely with his head. "My horse went lame a few miles back. Figured it was better to wait out the storm here than drown in it." Eleanor's mind raced. An outlaw? A drifter? Men like this were dangerous. Her father had warned her of them. They had no respect for station or decency. "We require the use of this barn for the night. Our coach has broken down." She tried to inject a note of authority into her tone, the tone of a woman who was accustomed to being obeyed. A faint, humorless smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Barn is big enough for all of us. I will keep to my corner. You keep to yours." He turned and walked back toward the shadows, dismissing them. The sheer insolence of it stoked a flicker of anger through Eleanor's fear. He was not offering them shelter. He was permitting them to share his... But what could she do? They were trapped, 2 women alone with a stranger, miles from anywhere. Arguing would be foolish, even dangerous. She led Martha to a pile of relatively clean hay on the opposite side of the barn. As far from the man as they could get, they sat down, pulling their damp cloaks around them. The single lantern cast long, distorted shadows that made the vast space feel both immense and claustrophobic. The man, Silas Beckett, was little more than a silhouette against the far wall, a darker patch of darkness. For a long time, the only sounds were the storm and Martha's quiet, frightened sobs. Eleanor tried to stay rigid, to maintain her composure, but the cold was seeping into her bones, and a deep, shuddering exhaustion was setting in. The day had been too long, the strain too great. Her carefully constructed walls were beginning to crack. After what felt like an hour, the man's voice came out of the darkness again, startling her. "You are shivering." It was a statement, not a question. "I am fine," she replied, her voice stiff. There was a moment of silence, then the sound of movement. He walked back into the light, carrying a worn saddle blanket. It was not clean, but it looked thick and warm. He stopped a few feet away from them and tossed it onto the hay. "It will help," he said, his tone flat. Martha flinched as if he had thrown a snake at them. Eleanor stared at the blanket, then up at him. His face was impassive in the flickering light. It was a simple gesture, perhaps one of mere practicality, but it was the first kindness, however rough, she had been shown all day. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He gave a curt nod and retreated to his corner. Eleanor hesitantly reached out and pulled the blanket over herself and Martha. It smelled of horse and leather and the faint, masculine scent of the man himself. It was surprisingly warm. The hours crept by. The storm did not abate. Martha, worn out by fear and exhaustion, eventually cried herself to sleep, her head resting in Eleanor's lap. Eleanor, however, was wide awake. Her fear had receded, replaced by a strange, hyper-aware tension. She was intensely conscious of the man across the barn. She could not see him, but she could feel his presence, a steady, watchful weight in the darkness. She found herself wondering about him. Where had he come from? Where was he going? Men did not just wander the territory without a purpose. He was running from something, or to something. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, she spoke into the darkness. "Mr. Beckett?" His reply was immediate, as if he had been waiting. "Ma'am, you are not from around here." It was a foolish thing to say. No one was from around here. It was a land of transients, of people trying to outrun their pasts. "Lived a lot of places," he answered, his voice non-committal. "And what is it you do?" she pressed, a strange boldness taking hold of her. In the anonymity of the darkness, the rigid rules of polite society seemed to fade. There was a long pause. "I survive." The answer was stark, and it silenced her. It was the truest thing she had heard in a long time. It was, after all, what she was trying to do. She was on her way to marry a powerful man, a man who could provide for her, protect her, a noble arrangement, a sensible one. She said the words to herself, testing them. They sounded hollow in the echoing emptiness of the barn. "You are headed to Prescott?" he asked, turning the question back on her. "To the Gable Ranch," she said, a little too quickly. She wanted him to know. She wanted him to understand that she was not just some lost woman in a storm. She was engaged to Clayton Gable. The name was a shield, a declaration of power. She waited for a reaction, surprise, perhaps, or a flicker of respect. She got neither. The silence from his corner stretched on, thick with something she could not name. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, lower, and laced with a bitterness that was sharp enough to taste. "Clayton Gable," he said, speaking the name as if it were a curse. "So you are the new bride." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "You know him?" A dry, mirthless chuckle came from the darkness. "Every man in this territory knows of him, or knows what he has done." "He is a respected man," she said, her voice defensive. It was what her father had told her. It was what she had to believe. "He is a rich man," Silas corrected. "That is not the same thing. Some men get rich by building things up. Men like Gable, they get rich by tearing things down. Lives, mostly." A flash of lightning illuminated the barn, and for a split second, Eleanor saw him clearly. He had shifted, and his shirt, damp and clinging to his frame, had pulled tight across his back. Her breath caught in her throat. Even in that fleeting glimpse, she had seen them. Old scars, white and silver against his tanned skin, a lattice of raised welts that could only have come from a whip, and the deeper, puckered crater of an old bullet wound high on his shoulder. This was not just a cowboy. This was a man who had known profound violence, both given and received. The darkness returned, but the image was burned into her mind. The scars told a story, one that made her own carefully managed troubles seem small and naive. His voice, when he spoke again, was freighted with the weight of that story. "You listen to me, ma'am. You be careful around a man like that. Power does not make a man good. It just makes him powerful. It gives him the ability to buy whatever he wants. Land, cattle, people. And it lets him write the laws to suit himself. He can ruin a man, throw him in jail, take everything he has, and call it justice." Every word was a stone dropped into the still pool of her denial. Her father's words echoed in her ears. "He has made a most generous offer. He has offered to settle our debts." She was not a bride. She was a debt, settled in full. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. He had seen through her, through the fine dress and the polite words, and had looked straight at the terrified, bartered soul beneath. He had seen the truth of her situation more clearly than she had allowed herself to. And as she sat there in the dark, with the storm raging outside and a sleeping maid in her lap, Eleanor Vance felt something shift deep within her. It was a dangerous, forbidden thing. It was sympathy. Sympathy for this rough, scarred stranger. His bitterness was not just anger. It was pain. A pain she was just beginning to understand. And as his pain reached across the darkness and touched her own, the first crack appeared in the dam of her composure, and a lifetime of unshed tears began to press against the back of her eyes. The rain did not lessen. It fell with a furious, steady violence, as if intent on washing the world clean of all its sins and sorrows. Inside the barn, the drumming on the roof was a constant, hypnotic roar that vibrated through the old timbers and into Eleanor's bones. Martha had long since succumbed to a fitful, whimpering sleep, her small body curled into a ball beside Eleanor, a child seeking refuge from a nightmare. Her slumber removed the last fragile barrier of propriety, leaving Eleanor adrift in the cavernous dark with the stranger. They were two solitary souls marooned on an island of hay, surrounded by a raging sea. Lightning split the sky, and for a silent, blue-white second, the barn was illuminated in stark detail. She saw Silas Beckett across the expanse, leaning against a support beam. He was not looking at her, but staring out a crack in the wall, his profile a hard, stoic line against the tempest. The light caught the sharp angle of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. He looked like a man wrestling with ghosts she could not see. When the darkness crashed back in, his voice followed, closer than she expected. He had moved without a sound. "She will be out till morning." Eleanor flinched, her heart leaping into her throat. "Yes, the day has been trying for her." "For you both," he said. She heard the faint scuff of a boot on the dirt floor as he came nearer, stopping a respectful distance away. Then, the soft scrape of metal on glass, and a liquid gurgle. This might help take the chill off. He stepped into the lantern light. In his hand was a flat, metal flask, dented and worn. He held it out to her. It was whiskey. She was sure of it. The smell, sharp and potent, cut through the damp air. A lady did not drink spirits. Certainly not from a man's flask. Certainly not a man such as this. The rules of her life, the carefully constructed cage of her upbringing, screamed in protest. She looked from the flask to his face. His eyes were not challenging, nor were they mocking. They were simply watching, waiting. It was an offer, plain and simple. Not a test, just a recognition of their shared misery. In that moment, her thirst for a moment's warmth, for a single act of defiance against the cold and the fear and the future that awaited her, was stronger than a lifetime of etiquette. Her hand trembled as she reached out and took it. The metal was cool against her skin. She raised it to her lips, hesitated, then took a small, cautious sip. Fire. A raw, liquid heat slid down her throat, burning away the cold and the tightness in her chest. She coughed, a small, choked sound, and handed it back to him. He took a longer drink, his throat working, then stoppered the flask. "Better?" She could only nod, the warmth spreading through her veins. A dangerous, welcome intruder. It loosened something inside her, a knot of fear she had been holding so tightly she had forgotten it was there. He did not retreat to his corner. Instead, he sank to the ground, cross-legged, a few feet from her, leaning his back against the same stack of hay bales. The space between them was charged with a new kind of silence, less hostile, more aware. "You should not be out here," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm's percussion. "A woman like you." "A woman like me has little say in the matter," she replied, the whiskey making her bolder than she knew how to be. The words were out before she could stop them. "I go where I am told." He was silent for a long moment, seeming to turn her words over in his mind. "Told by who? Your father?" She stiffened. It was too close, too personal. "My family's arrangements are my own concern." "Are they?" he asked, his voice still quiet, but with an edge that cut through her defenses. "Seems to me they are about to become Clayton Gable's concern." He paused. "And from what I know of Gable, he makes his concerns everyone's problem." A wave of panic and shame washed over her. She had said too much. She was speaking to a complete stranger, a drifter, about the most private and painful arrangement of her life. She was betraying her family, her duty. "You know nothing about my life." "I know what it looks like when a bird is being put in a gilded cage," he said, his voice softening unexpectedly. "I have seen it before. The cage is beautiful, and everyone tells the bird how lucky it is, but the door only locks from the outside." He looked at her then, and in the dim, shifting light, his eyes held a profound and weary understanding. "I know you feel trapped." Her breath hitched. He had spoken the word she had not dared to form even in her own thoughts. Trapped. The truth of it was so absolute, so suffocating, that hearing it spoken aloud felt like a physical blow. She recoiled, pulling her cloak tighter around her, turning her face away. "You are mistaken." He did not press her. He did not mock the transparent weakness of her denial. He just watched her. His silence a strange sort of comfort. It was a silence that did not demand anything from her. It simply made space for her pain. After a long while, he began to speak again, his gaze fixed on some distant point in the darkness. "I spent a year in the Yuma prison," The admission was so stark, so unexpected, that Eleanor turned back to look at him. Yuma. The name itself was a synonym for hell on earth. A sun-scorched pit where the worst of men were sent to be baked alive. "It was for horse theft," he continued, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, as if he were recounting a story that had happened to someone else. "They said I stole 3 mares from a man named Abernathy, a rich man with friends in high places." "Did you?" The question was a whisper. He finally looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was so raw it was startling. "No, I did not. Abernathy owed me 2 months' wages. When I went to collect, he had his foreman beat me and run me off his land. I was young and full of pride. I told him I would see him get what was coming to him. 2 days later, the sheriff found his prize mares on the small plot of land I was renting. My saddle was on one of them." He gave a bitter, humorless smile. "Abernathy's lie was bigger than my truth. His money was louder than my word. So I went to Yuma." He fell silent, and Eleanor could almost feel the heat of that prison, see the high stone walls, hear the clang of the iron doors. She saw the scars on his back with new eyes. They were not from a fair fight. They were the marks of punishment, of a man broken by a system that favored the powerful. "There was a woman," Silas said, his voice dropping so low she had to strain to hear him over the rain. "Before, her name was Sarah. We were to be married. When they took me," she believed them, or maybe it was easier to believe them. "Abernathy. He whispered things to her, told her I was a thief and a scoundrel, that she was better off without me. He offered her security, a job in his house, a clean life. Last I heard, she married a shopkeeper in Prescott, has 2 children now." He took the flask and had another long swallow. The story hung in the air between them, a ghost of a life that had been stolen, a life destroyed by the casual cruelty of a wealthy man, a man just like Clayton Gable. The whiskey, the storm, the terrible intimacy of his confession. It all worked together to finally shatter Eleanor's control. The tears she had held back for months began to well in her eyes. "It is not for love," she admitted, the words tearing from her throat, ragged and painful. "My marriage, it is survival. My father, he made mistakes, bad investments. He gambled. We were ruined, utterly. Clayton Gable paid our debts. He bought our house, our name. He bought me. My family sold me. Mr. Beckett, they sold me to save themselves." The confession was out, ugly and complete. She was no better than a horse being sold at auction, her pedigree noted, her teeth checked, a price agreed upon. She felt stripped bare, her shame a raw, open wound. Silas did not look away. He did not offer pity. Instead, a muscle in his jaw tightened, and a low, dangerous anger smoldered in his eyes. "So they dress it up in a white gown and call it a wedding?" His anger, so fierce and righteous on her behalf, was more than she could bear. It was the validation she had never received, the outrage she had never been allowed to feel. "You cannot understand," she cried, a surge of confused desperation rising in her. She was defending the very people who had condemned her. "It was my duty. What choice did he have? What choice did I have?" "There is always a choice," he shot back, his voice rising for the first time, sharp and hard as flint. "Maybe not an easy one, maybe a choice between starving and serving, but to sell your own daughter? To hand her over to a man like that? That is not a choice. That is a coward's bargain." His words struck her like a slap. They argued then, their voices hushed but intense, a frantic, desperate clash of her lifetime of duty against his lifetime of rebellion. She defended her father's honor, a hollow, crumbling fortress, and he attacked the injustice of her fate with a fury that seemed to come from the very core of him. Finally, their anger spent, they fell into a tense, breathless stillness. The air in the barn was thick with unspoken things, with the raw, bleeding truths they had laid at each other's feet. The night deepened. The lantern flickered, its oil running low. The storm outside began to ease, the thunder receding into a distant grumble, but the storm inside Eleanor was just breaking. She looked at this man, this stranger who had seen her more clearly in a few hours than her own family had in a lifetime. He was scarred, an outcast, a man with nothing to his name but a history of pain, and yet, in his presence, she felt, for the first time, seen. Her carefully ordered world had been shattered. Duty, honor, obedience, they were just words, pretty decorations on a cage. What was real was the cold dread in her stomach and the aching, hollow loneliness in her heart. And the man sitting just a few feet away, who knew what it was to be wronged, to be trapped, to be utterly alone? Slowly, deliberately, she rose to her feet. The movement was stiff, every muscle in her body protesting. Silas looked up at her, his expression guarded. "What are you doing?" She did not answer. She took a step toward him, then another. The dirt floor was cold beneath her thin shoes. He pushed himself to his feet, a dark, imposing silhouette against the dying lantern light. He held up a hand, a warning. "Do not, Mom, you do not want to do this. In the morning, you will be on your way to your new life. You cannot—" "My new life," she interrupted, her voice a broken whisper. "My new life is a lie. It is an obligation. It is a cage." She took another step, closing the distance until she was standing directly before him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. She had to tilt her head back to look up into his face. "I have done my duty my entire life. I have been quiet. I have been good. And this is my reward." Her emotions, a lifetime of them, were cracking open, spilling out. An immense, aching want rose up in her, not just for him, but for a single moment of her own. One choice that was not dictated by debt or duty. One moment of feeling, of being real. She reached up, her trembling fingers touching the rough fabric of his shirt. He was solid, real. He did not move, but she could feel the tension thrumming through him, a battle being fought in the stillness. The barn, with its scent of hay and rain and earth, became a confessional, a sanctuary for two broken souls. All their pain, their secrets, their unspoken loneliness hung in the air between them. She looked into his eyes, and she saw her own desperation mirrored there. She leaned in, her voice so soft it was almost carried away by the wind whistling through the walls. "It is just one night." It was a plea, a promise, an absolution. Something in him broke, with a low groan that was part pain, part surrender. He closed the final space between them. His arms came around her, pulling her against him with a desperate strength that stole her breath. His mouth found hers, and it was not a gentle kiss. It was a clash, a collision of hunger and sorrow. It tasted of whiskey and rain, and a loneliness so profound it felt like coming home. It was not perfect. It was raw and desperate and messy. His hands were rough in her hair. Her fingers clutched at the hard muscle of his back. It was a frantic, urgent coming together. Two people trying to erase a world of hurt in the space of a few heartbeats. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing and carried her to the deepest, softest pile of hay, laying her down with a strange, fierce tenderness. In the dying light of the lantern, surrounded by the echoes of the storm, they shed their armor of civility and sorrow and met in the raw, honest language of touch. It was a desperate act of rebellion, a fleeting moment of grace in a world that had offered them none. Afterward, as they lay tangled in the scratchy hay and the worn saddle blanket, the silence returned. But it was a different silence now, filled with the soft sounds of their breathing. And then, a small, choked sob escaped Eleanor's lips. Then another. The tears she had held back for so long finally came, not in a torrent, but in a slow, silent, heartbreaking stream. She cried for the girl she had been, for the woman she was supposed to be, and for the utter, terrifying freedom of the choice she had just made. Silas shifted, propping himself up on one elbow to look down at her. In the gloom, she could just make out the shape of his face, the concern etched there. He did not ask her why she was crying. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply lay back down, gathered her into his arms, and held her. He held her as she shook with silent sobs, his hand stroking her hair, his steady presence a solid, unwavering anchor in the storm of her release and in the safety of his embrace. Eleanor Vance wept until there were no tears left. Dawn arrived not as a warm, golden promise, but as a slow, reluctant bleeding of pale gray light through the cracks in the barn walls. It was a cold, unforgiving light, the color of ash and regret. Eleanor woke to it, feeling the chill deep in her bones. For a disorienting moment, she did not know where she was. The scratch of hay against her cheek, the unfamiliar weight of a man's saddle blanket, the scent of rain-soaked earth, it all came rushing back in a dizzying, heart-stopping wave. She turned her head. The space beside her was empty. A cold dread, sharper than the morning air, seized her. She sat up, her movement stiff and clumsy, her borrowed warmth gone. The barn was silent save for the dripping of water from the eaves. He was gone. Silas Beckett had vanished as completely as a ghost at sunrise, leaving behind nothing but the imprint of his body in the hay and the lingering scent of whiskey and leather on the blanket. Then her eyes caught it, a small, folded square of cheap paper, tucked into a fold of the blanket where he had lain. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. She unfolded it. The script was rough, blunt, the letters formed by a hand more accustomed to holding reins than a pen. There were only 6 words. "You deserved more than one night." The paper fell from her fingers. It was not a promise. It was not a farewell. It was a judgment, a verdict on the life she was returning to. It was a confirmation of the value of the moment they had shared, a moment that was now dissolving into the harsh light of day. A single, perfect tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek and fell onto the dusty floor. "Miss Eleanor?" Martha's voice, thick with sleep, cut through the quiet. She sat up, blinking, her hair a tangled mess, her eyes wide and confused. She looked at Eleanor, at her disheveled state, at the saddle blanket clutched in her hands, and then her gaze swept the empty barn. The slow, dawning horror on her face was agonizing to watch. "Miss Eleanor," she whispered, her voice a frightened hiss. "The man, where is he?" "He is gone," Eleanor said, her own voice sounding hollow and distant to her ears. Martha scrambled to her feet, her hands fluttering at her throat. "Gone, but he was here all night. I heard you. I heard voices." Her eyes, wide with panic, darted from Eleanor's face to the deeply disturbed pile of hay where they had lain. Understanding, terrible and absolute, crashed over her. "Oh, dear Lord in heaven, no, Miss Eleanor, what have you done?" "Nothing that concerns you, Martha," Eleanor said, a cold, brittle wall of composure rising around her. "Not my concern?" the maid cried, her voice cracking. "We are to be at the Gable Ranch by midday, for your wedding. Do you understand what this means? You are ruined. If Mr. Gable finds out, he will kill you. He will kill us both." She grabbed Eleanor's arm, her fingers digging in like claws. "You must tell me everything. Did he force you?" The question held a desperate, pleading hope. An attack could be explained, could be hidden. A choice could not. Eleanor looked into the servant's terrified eyes and saw a reflection of the world she was meant to inhabit, a world of rules and ruin, where a woman's worth was as fragile as a pane of glass. She pulled her arm away. "He did not force me." The words, spoken with quiet finality, seemed to suck the very air from the barn. Martha stared at her, her mouth agape, her face pale with a mixture of terror and revulsion. She took a step back, as if Eleanor were suddenly afflicted with a contagious plague. "Then you are lost," she breathed. "We are all lost. The heavy groan of the barn door swinging open saved Eleanor from having to reply. "Mr. Thompson stood there, silhouetted against the gray morning, a younger man at his side. "Ma'am, brought young Miller from the way station to help. We will have you on your way within the hour." The journey to the Gable Ranch was a silent, suffocating ordeal. Martha huddled in the far corner of the repaired coach, casting furtive, fearful glances at Eleanor, her lips moving in what looked like a frantic, silent prayer. Eleanor said nothing. She stared out the window at the landscape, now washed clean by the storm. The sun was breaking through the clouds, setting the wet red rocks ablaze, but she felt none of its warmth. She was a vessel of ice, frozen around the secret memory of the night. She kept her hand clenched in the pocket of her cloak, her fingers wrapped around a folded square of cheap paper. The Gable estate was not a ranch. It was a fortress. It rose from the plains like a monument to one man's indomitable will. The house was a sprawling, two-story adobe structure, built around a central courtyard, its walls thick enough to repel an army. Corrals and outbuildings spread out from it like a spider's web, teeming with men and horses. This was not a home. It was an empire, and Clayton Gable was its undisputed king. He met her on the veranda. He was a man made of solid, immovable substance, thick in the chest and neck, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite. His hair was the color of iron filings, but his eyes were a pale, piercing blue that missed nothing. He was dressed in a fine, dark suit that seemed out of place in the rugged landscape, a concession to the civility of the occasion. He took her hand, his grip firm, possessive. "Miss Vance, I trust your journey was not too arduous." "We were delayed by the storm," she said, her voice a perfect, polished veneer. His cold eyes swept over her, taking in her travel-worn appearance, the faint shadows under her eyes. A flicker of something, impatience, perhaps, crossed his face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "The preparations are made. You will want to rest. The Reverend arrives at 3. He did not smile. He did not offer a single word of comfort or affection. It was a statement of logistics, the final confirmation of a business transaction. The wedding was a blur, a strange, out-of-body experience. Eleanor stood beside Clayton Gable in the grand parlor of his house, which smelled of beeswax and old money. She wore the white silk dress her mother had been married in, a relic from a life of grace and gentility that felt like a costume. The few witnesses were Gable's foremen and their wives, their face stern and unreadable. She said the vows, her voice steady, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She felt Clayton's thick gold ring slide onto her finger, a heavy, cold manacle. He lifted her veil, and his kiss was dry, brief, a seal of ownership. Throughout the ceremony, she felt his eyes on her, assessing her, and she detected a subtle shift. There was a quiet defiance in her stillness, a refusal to feign the joy or modesty of a bride. He noticed it. She knew he did, but he said nothing. His expression one of supreme, unshakable confidence in his own power to control her, to break her if necessary. That night, in the enormous, cold bedroom that was now hers, he asserted his rights as a husband. He was not overtly brutal, but there was no tenderness, no passion. It was a methodical, passionless act of possession, another asset being claimed. Eleanor endured it. She lay perfectly still, her body a rigid, unfeeling shell. Her mind was 1,000 miles away, back in a dark, storm-tossed barn. She focused on the memory of a rough hand gently stroking her hair, of a low voice confessing its pain, of a kiss that was both a wound and a healing. She retreated into the memory of that one night, using it as a shield to protect the last, secret part of herself that Clayton Gable could not touch. A week passed. Life in the Gable household was one of suffocating, orderly routine. Eleanor was the mistress of the house, but she was a queen with no power, a prisoner in a palace. The servants were respectful but distant, their loyalty belonging solely to the man who paid their wages. Clayton was a cold, possessive presence. He demanded her presence at meals, paraded her before his business associates like a prized acquisition, but spoke to her of nothing personal. He watched her constantly, his pale eyes following her every move, as if expecting to find a flaw in his new purchase. One evening, as she was dressing for dinner, he came into the bedroom without knocking. He watched her as she fastened the buttons on her dress, his gaze sharp and critical. "There is a mark on your shoulder," he said, his voice flat. Eleanor froze. She followed his gaze to the reflection in the mirror. A faint, purplish-yellow bruise, the last fading ghost of Silas's desperate grip, was visible just above the collar of her dress. "I must have bumped into something," she said, her heart hammering against her ribs. He walked over to her, his steps heavy on the polished floorboards. He reached out and roughly pushed the fabric of her dress aside, exposing the mark more clearly. His thumb traced its edge, his touch cold and clinical. "I did not put it there." It was not a question. It was an accusation. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. "As I said, I must have been careless." He let go of her, but his eyes remained on her, narrowed and suspicious. "You will be more careful in the future," he said, his voice a low, soft threat. "Everything in this house belongs to me. That includes you. I expect my property to be kept in pristine condition." He turned and left the room, leaving her standing there, trembling, the place where he had touched her feeling as if it had been burned. The following day, she was required to ride into the nearby town of Redemption with him to procure supplies. The town was little more than a single dusty street lined with wooden storefronts, a place that lived and breathed on the money from the Gable Ranch. As Clayton conducted his business in the mercantile, Eleanor stood on the boardwalk, pretending to admire a display of boat cloth. And then she saw him. He was across the street, leaning against a post in front of the saloon. "Silas!" Her breath caught in her throat. He was clean-shaven now, and his clothes were less worn. But it was him. The same hard lines of his face, the same broad shoulders, the same unnerving stillness. He was not looking at her. He was staring down the street, his expression unreadable. But then, as if feeling the weight of her gaze, he lifted his head. His eyes met hers across the dusty expanse. The world seemed to fall away. The noise of the street, the rattling of wagons, the shouts of men, the tinny piano from the saloon, it all faded into a dull roar. There was only the silent, invisible rope that stretched between them, pulling taut. His expression did not change, but she saw a flicker of something in the depths of his blue eyes. Recognition. Pain. A question he could not ask. She stood frozen, her hand clutching the railing of the boardwalk, her heart aching with a sudden, impossible longing. She wanted to run to him, to say his name, but she could not. She was Mrs. Clayton Gable. He was a drifter. They were two people from different worlds, and the street between them was as wide and impassable as the Grand Canyon. The moment was shattered by Clayton's voice at her side. "It is time to go." She tore her gaze away, her cheeks flushing with heat, terrified that he might have seen. When she risked a glance back across the street, Silas was gone. But it was too late. People had noticed. The town of Redemption was small, and its primary currency was gossip. The sight of the new, beautiful Mrs. Gable staring so intently at a rough-looking stranger was enough to set tongues wagging. Whispers began to circulate, quiet at first, then growing in volume. Rumors about the bride's strange, distant behavior. Rumors about the mysterious cowboy who had shown up in town the same week she had arrived. Clayton heard the gossip. He heard it from his foreman, from the shopkeepers who depended on his patronage. He said nothing to Eleanor for 2 days. He let the silence and her own fear fester. Then, on the third night, he confronted her in the parlor. He had been drinking. She could smell the whiskey on his breath. He stood in front of the fireplace, blocking the warmth, a figure of immense, contained rage. "They are talking about you in town," he said, his voice deceptively soft. "They say you have a wandering eye. They say you were staring at a saddle tramp as if you knew him." "I do not know what you mean," she lied, her voice thin. "Do not lie to me," he roared, and the sudden violence of it made her flinch. He crossed the room in 2 strides and grabbed her by the upper arms, his fingers biting into her flesh. He dragged her close, his face inches from hers. Who was he? The man in the barn? Was it him? Her blood ran cold. Martha, the maid must have broken. When she did not answer, he shook her, her head snapping back. "Answer me!" Tears of fear and pain sprang to her eyes, but she would not give him the satisfaction. She met his gaze, her own filled with a defiance she did not know she possessed. His face contorted with fury. He raised his hand and struck her, a hard, open-palmed blow that sent her staggering backward. The side of her face exploded in pain, and she fell against a heavy oak table, her ears ringing. He stood over her, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling. "Listen to me, and listen well," he snarled, his voice a low, menacing whisper. "You are mine. Your name is mine. Your body is mine. Your soul is mine. If I ever see you look at another man again, if I ever hear another whisper about you in town, I will not just mark you. I will lock you in a room where you will never see the light of day again. You belong to me." He turned and strode from the room, leaving her crumpled on the floor, the metallic taste of blood in her mouth. She did not cry. The pain was a sharp, clarifying fire. In that moment, something inside her hardened into steel. He did not own her. He could bruise her body, lock her away, but he could not touch the memory of that night. He could not own the part of her that had come alive in the arms of a scarred and gentle stranger. The next afternoon, she took a horse and rode to the small, sun-bleached adobe church on the edge of town. It was empty. The air inside was cool and still, smelling of dust and dry wood. She did not go to the priest. She had no sins to confess that she regretted. She walked to the front and sat in the first pew, staring at the simple wooden cross on the altar. She did not pray. She spoke, her voice a soft, tremulous whisper in the echoing silence. "I think I have sinned," she said to the stillness, to God, to herself. "I broke my vows before they were even made. I lay with a man I did not know. By every law of God and man, I am a fallen woman. I am ruined." She paused, a single tear tracing a path down her bruised cheek. But it did not feel like a sin. It felt like I was being saved. She stayed there for a long time, finding a strange peace in the quiet admission. When she finally left, stepping back out into the harsh sunlight, she saw him. Silas was waiting by a grove of cottonwood trees near the creek, as if he knew she would be there. This time, there was no street between them. She walked toward him, her heart a wild, frantic bird in her chest. He looked haggard, his face etched with worry. He saw the bruise on her cheek, and a dark, dangerous light flared in his eyes. He took a step toward her, then stopped, forcing himself to stay back. "You should not be here," he said, his voice rough. "You have to stay away from me. It is not safe." "Safe?" she asked, a bitter, broken laugh escaping her lips. "Do you think I am safe in that house?" "Eleanor," he said, speaking her name for the first time, and the sound of it on his lips was both sweet and painful. "This is my fault. I never should have—" "It was not your fault," she interrupted. "It was my choice, the only real choice I have ever made." She took another step, her composure finally crumbling. The tears she had refused to shed for her husband now fell for this man. "He knows. He suspects. He hit me." The words hung in the air. A terrible, ugly truth. The fight went out of Silas. The anger in his face was replaced by a profound, heart-wrenching pain. He closed the distance between them and hesitated for only a second before his arms went around her, pulling her into a gentle, protective embrace. She broke down then, her body shaking with sobs, burying her face in the rough fabric of his shirt. He just held her, his hand stroking her hair, murmuring her name over and over again like a prayer. He had tried to push her away, for her own good, but he could not. They were bound together by the secret of one night, a night that was no longer just a memory, but the beginning of a dangerous, impossible future. The house had become a mausoleum, a place of watchful, suffocating silence. Clayton's paranoia was a living thing, a poison that seeped into the very walls. He no longer needed to watch Eleanor himself. He had other eyes now. 2 new ranch hands, men with hard, empty faces and guns worn low on their hips, had been hired. They did not work with the cattle. Their sole purpose, Eleanor quickly realized, was to follow her. One was always in the stables when she went to ride, the other always mending a fence or oiling a saddle near the main house. They were her shadows, her jailers, and their constant, silent presence was a weight on her soul. The breaking point came with Martha. One afternoon, Eleanor came upon the maidservant leaving Clayton's study, a room Eleanor was forbidden to enter. The girl's face was as white as bleached bone, her eyes red-rimmed and swimming with a terror so profound it made Eleanor's own blood run cold. Martha would not meet her gaze. She scurried away, her shoulders hunched, a small, broken creature. Eleanor knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in her gut, what had happened. Clayton had interrogated her. He had taken the girl's simple fears and twisted them, squeezed them, until the truth of that night in the barn had come spilling out. He now had confirmation of his suspicions. He did not confront Eleanor immediately. He preferred to let the knowledge hang between them, a sharpened blade, waiting for the right moment to fall. The quiet in the house grew heavier, the silence now filled with the teeth of his unspent rage. She had to see Silas. It was no longer a want, but a desperate, primal need. She managed it by feigning a sudden piety, a desire to visit the church in redemption every few days to pray for guidance. It was a role Clayton seemed to enjoy, the idea of his wayward wife seeking salvation. He allowed it, but his shadows were never far behind. One of them would wait with the horses outside the church, a silent, looming sentinel. The note came via the Reverend's daughter, a gangly, kind-eyed girl of 12 named Sarah, who sometimes swept the church floors. She slipped the folded paper into Eleanor's hand as she passed her in the aisle, her expression a mixture of childish excitement and conspiratorial fear. "From the man at the creek," she whispered, and was gone. The note gave a time and a place. Dusk, 2 days hence, at the mouth of Whisper Canyon, a narrow, winding cut in the rocks 5 miles north of town. It was a place no one went. It was dangerous. It was perfect. For 2 days, Eleanor lived on a knife's edge of anticipation and terror. She planned her escape with the meticulous care of a general plotting a campaign. She told Clayton she wished to make a private pilgrimage to a small, cross-shaped rock formation her mother had once written about in a letter, a place of quiet contemplation. She would need to go alone. She insisted, to make her peace with God. The lie was so pious, so perfectly in character for the refined woman she was supposed to be, that he could not refuse without revealing the depths of his own profane suspicion. He agreed, his eyes cold and hard, but she knew he would have her followed. She rode out in the late afternoon, taking the main trail north. Her shadow, a man named Boone with a scar that split his left eyebrow, followed at a lazy, confident distance. She let him follow her for 3 miles. Then, rounding a sharp bend obscured by a thick stand of mesquite, she spurred her horse, a fast, sure-footed mare, off the trail and into the treacherous, broken country of the foothills. She rode hard, her heart pounding with the thrill of rebellion, weaving through arroyos and over rocky ridges, pushing the mare until her sides were heaving. When she finally risked a look back from a high vantage point, the trail behind her was empty. She had lost him. She found the entrance to Whisper Canyon as the sun began to set. painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Silas was there, hidden in the deep shadows of the towering rock walls, his horse tethered nearby. He stepped out as she approached, and the relief that washed over her was so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. He helped her dismount, his hands strong and steady on her waist. For a long moment, they just stood there, drinking in the sight of each other. He reached up and gently touched the faded bruise on her cheek, his expression hardening into a mask of cold fury. "He will pay for this, Eleanor," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "It does not matter," she whispered, leaning into his touch. "All that matters is that I am here." They walked deeper into the canyon, the high rock walls muffling the sound of the outside world, creating a pocket of profound, intimate silence. A thin stream of water, the last remnant of the storm that had brought them together, trickled over the stones. "This is madness," he said, his back to her as he stared at the darkening sky. "We cannot keep doing this. He knows. You said it yourself." "I know," she said, her voice catching. "But I cannot bear it. Silas, the silence in that house, the way he looks at me, it is like being buried alive." She took a deep breath. "We have to leave. Together." The words, spoken aloud for the first time, seemed to hang in the cool canyon air. Escape. It was a fantasy, a desperate dream. Silas turned to face her, and the anguish in his eyes was a physical blow. "Leave and go where? Do what? Eleanor, look at me. I have nothing, less than nothing. I am a drifter with a prison record and a dozen enemies. What kind of life could I give you? We would be running forever, always looking over our shoulder." "I do not care about the kind of life," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "I care about having a life at all. With you." "You do not understand what you are asking for," he said, his voice rough with pain. "I am a ghost. Eleanor, the man I was supposed to be. He died in that prison in Yuma. What is left is just scarred and broken. I will drag you down into the dark with me." He shook his head, a look of profound self-loathing on his face. "You are a lady. You deserve fine things, a safe home. You deserve more. You do not deserve a man like me." Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. She stepped forward and laid her hands on his chest, feeling the frantic, steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. "Do you think I care about being a lady anymore?" she asked, her voice trembling with a passion she did not know she possessed. "That lady is a lie. She was bought and paid for. Her honor, her duty, her morality. It is all just part of the price. I am already ruined in the eyes of God and the world. So why not ruin myself for love? Why not choose my own damnation?" He stared down at her, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. "Eleanor." "Do not tell me what I deserve," she whispered fiercely. "You are the only person who has ever seen me. Not the daughter, not the bride, not the property, just me. I am not asking for forever. I am not asking for a safe home or fine things. I am just asking not to be alone anymore." He finally broke, with a sound that was half a sob, half a groan. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against him. He buried his face in her hair, his body shaking with the force of his emotions. "I love you," he breathed, the words muffled against her skin. "God help me, I love you." They stayed there for what felt like an eternity, two broken people clinging to each other in the fading light, their impossible love a fragile, flickering candle in the vast, encroaching darkness. They spoke of the future, not as a plan, but as a dream. They could go west, to California, or north to Oregon. He could find work. She could learn to live with less. They could find a small piece of land, a place where the names Gable and Beckett meant nothing. It was a fool's hope, but it was all they had. The ride back to the ranch was a descent from a dream into a nightmare. As Eleanor approached the town of Redemption, she saw a crowd gathered in front of the sheriff's office. A cold, sick feeling coiled in her stomach. She spurred her horse forward, pushing through the throng of onlookers. And then she saw him. Silas, his hands bound in front of him, was being pushed up the steps to the jail by Sheriff Miller and one of Gable's men. "What is happening?" she demanded, her voice high and shrill. "What has he done?" Sheriff Miller, a man with a drooping mustache and the weary eyes of someone who had long ago compromised his integrity, refused to look at her. "Evening. Mrs. Gable. This man was found trespassing on your husband's northern range. He was also in possession of a saddle that went missing from your stables last week." "That is a lie," she cried, swinging down from her horse. "He has done nothing wrong." "That will be for the circuit judge to decide," the sheriff said, his tone flat and final. He shoved Silas through the door and closed it, the sound of the bolt sliding home echoing in the street. Eleanor ran to the door, pounding on it with her fists. "Sheriff, let him out! This is a mistake!" She turned to the crowd, her eyes wild. "This is Clayton Gable's doing. Can you not see that? He is using the law to settle a personal score." Some of the townspeople looked away. Their faces shuddered. Others watched with a sort of grim, detached curiosity. They all knew the truth. They knew that in this town, Clayton Gable was the law, but no one would speak up. Their livelihoods depended on his goodwill. She begged the sheriff, pleaded with him through the barred window, but he was immovable. The law favored Clayton Gable. The rich man's word would always be louder than the truth. Defeated. She slumped against the wall, the murmuring of the crowd a low, judgmental hum around her. Then, a small hand tugged on her sleeve. It was Sarah, the Reverend's daughter. She pushed a crumpled piece of paper into Eleanor's hand. "He told me to give this to you," she whispered. And then she darted back into the crowd and was gone. Eleanor waited until she was away from the town, hidden by the darkness, to read it. The words were scrawled hastily. "Do not worry. Do not do anything foolish. I will be all right. I love you." The note did not comfort her. It ignited a fire within her. He was telling her not to do anything foolish, but for the first time in her life, Eleanor Vance was ready to be a fool. She was ready to burn down the whole world to save him. She rode back to the ranch not in defeat, but with a new, terrifying resolve hardening in her heart. A rebellion was coming, her first true rebellion. She knew what she had to do. She had to find a weapon, something to use against her husband, and she knew where to look. His study, the one room he had forbidden her from entering. She waited until after midnight, until the great house was still and silent. She crept down the hallway, her bare feet making no sound on the cool floorboards. The door to his study was locked, as she knew it would be, but she had come prepared, using a small, silver letter opener from her own writing desk. She painstakingly worked at the lock. It was an old, simple mechanism. After several agonizing minutes, she heard a soft click, and the door swung open. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke and power. A massive mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface neat and orderly. She went to it, her hands shaking, and began to search. She pulled open drawers filled with contracts, deeds, and correspondence. It was in the bottom right drawer, hidden beneath a false bottom, that she found it, a thick, leather-bound ledger. She took it to the desk and opened it under the faint moonlight streaming through the window. The pages were filled with Clayton's precise, angular script. It was a second set of books, a secret accounting of his empire, and in it, she found the crime. Payments recorded to a drifter named Cowboy, followed by a final, large payment noted as "for his silence." And then, an entry dated 6 months prior. "Wages owed to J. Ames. Final settlement." She remembered the name. Jedediah Ames, a young ranch hand who had supposedly taken his pay and left in the middle of the night. But the whispers among the servants told a different story. They said he had argued with Gable over a poker game, that he had been found dead at the bottom of a ravine the next morning. His death ruled an accident. This ledger told the truth. Clayton had paid Calloway to kill him, and this was his record of the transaction. She took the ledger and went to find her husband. He was in their bedroom, reading by the light of an oil lamp. He looked up as she entered, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the book in her hands. She did not speak. She simply walked to the foot of the bed and threw the ledger down. It landed with a heavy thud. He looked at the book, then at her, his face a cold, unreadable mask. "You have been in my study." "I have," she said, her voice clear and steady, devoid of any fear. "And I have found your secrets, husband." He slowly closed his book and set it aside. "And what do you intend to do with them?" "You will go to the sheriff first thing in the morning," she said, her voice ringing with an authority she did not know she possessed. "You will tell him you made a mistake, that the saddle was found, that Silas Beckett was not trespassing. You will have all charges dropped, and you will see that he is released." For a long moment, he was silent. Then, a low, rumbling sound started in his chest. It grew until he threw his head back and laughed. It was not a sound of humor. It was a sound of pure, chilling contempt. "You foolish little girl," he said, his laughter subsiding into a sneer. "You think you can blackmail me with this?" He gestured to the ledger. "This book is my word against a dead man's, and in this territory, my word is law. You have nothing." "I will show it to the sheriff," she threatened. "I will show it to the circuit judge. Someone will listen." He rose from the bed and walked toward her, his movements slow, deliberate, like a predator cornering its prey. "No, they will not. They will listen to me. And I will tell them that my grieving, hysterical wife has forged these documents in a desperate attempt to free her lover." He stopped in front of her, so close she could feel the heat of his rage. "You have made a grave mistake, Eleanor. You have forgotten who I am, and you have forgotten what you are." He reached out, not to strike her face this time, but to grab her by the throat. His fingers wrapped around her neck, squeezing, cutting off her air. She gasped, clawing at his hand, her vision starting to swim with black spots. "You are my property," he hissed, his face a mask of fury. "And I do not tolerate my property rebelling against me." He slammed her backward against the wall, the impact jarring her teeth. He drew his other hand back, his fist clenched. "I will not kill you, not yet, but I will teach you a lesson you will never forget." He hit her, a brutal, punishing blow to the stomach that drove all the air from her lungs in a searing explosion of pain. She collapsed to the floor, gagging, unable to breathe. He stood over her for a moment, his chest heaving. Then he turned his back on her and walked back to his bed, as if she were nothing more than a piece of trash he had swept aside. She lay on the floor for what felt like an eternity, every breath a fresh wave of agony. She could hear him settling into bed, the rustle of the sheets. He was going to sleep. He had beaten her, nearly choked the life from her, and now he was going to sleep. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up. Blood trickled from her split lip. Her vision was blurry with tears of pain and rage. She looked at him, at the monstrous man lying in the bed she was forced to share, and she knew she could not stay another second in this house. Ignoring the screaming pain in her ribs, she stumbled from the room. She did not take anything with her, not a dress, not a piece of jewelry, only the ledger. She clutched it to her chest like a shield. She made her way through the dark, silent house and out into the cold night air. She did not go to the stables. He would expect that. Instead, she ran, a ragged, desperate flight into the darkness, leaving the fortress and its king behind her. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she had to get away. She left that night, bloody, but alive, and for the first time, she was free. The darkness before dawn was Eleanor's only ally. She ran until the searing pain in her side forced her to a stumbling walk, clutching the heavy ledger to her chest as if it were a shield. Her flight from the ranch was a blind, instinctual thing, a wounded animal seeking cover. She did not run to the town, but away from it, toward the sprawling, indifferent wilderness that began where Clayton Gable's land ended. She found refuge in a shallow, dry wash, huddling beneath an overhang of rock as the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky. Cold, bruised, and utterly alone. A strange and terrible clarity began to settle over her. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her belly, but beneath it, a new feeling was taking root. Rage. She knew they would be transferring Silas. A small-town jail like Redemption's was not meant for long-term prisoners. The circuit judge was due in Prescott in a week, and they would move him there, away from any potential sympathizers, away from her. She had to get to him before that happened. But how? She was one woman, with no weapon and no allies. The thought of an ally came to her with the memory of a kind, weathered face and hands that had always been gentle with the horses. Jacob, the old stable hand. He had been with her family for 30 years, a quiet, steady presence in the background of her life in Philadelphia, when her father's fortunes collapsed. Jacob had been dismissed with the rest of the staff, but when Eleanor was sent west, he had appeared at the train station, his few belongings in a cloth sack. Your mother, God rest her soul, was a kind woman. Miss Eleanor, he had said, his voice thick with an old loyalty that transcended employment. She would not want you going to a place like this alone. I will find work nearby. If you ever need anything, you find me. He had taken a job at the livery in Redemption, and she had seen him only a handful of times, exchanging quiet, sad nods that spoke of a shared, lost world. She found him as he was forking hay into a stall, the morning sun casting long shadows through the stable door. He took one look at her face, at the split lip and the dark, ugly bruise blooming on her cheek, and the pitchfork in his hands went still. His kindly eyes hardened into chips of flint. He did this to you, Jacob said. It was not a question. He did more than this, she whispered, her voice hoarse. Jacob, he has an innocent man in that jail. He means to see him hang. I need your help. She explained everything, the words tumbling out in a frantic, whispered rush. She told him of Silas, of the frame-up, of her escape. She did not tell him the full truth of her night in the barn, but she did not have to. The old man's eyes were wise, and he saw the story in her desperation. When she was finished, he was silent for a long time, his gaze distant. Your mother, he said finally, his voice soft with memory. She once found a blue jay with a broken wing in the garden. She spent a week nursing it, feeding it from her own hand. Said that every creature, no matter how small, deserved a chance to fly free. He looked back at Eleanor, and the resolve in his face was absolute. We will get your man out. Their plan was desperate, simple, and likely to get them both killed. Jacob learned from a talkative deputy that Silas was to be moved the next morning, in a simple buckboard wagon with 2 guards. They would take the old canyon road, a less traveled route, to avoid any trouble in town. That was their chance. Before dawn the next day, they were in position. Jacob had procured a heavy Greener shotgun, its twin barrels dark and menacing, and an old cavalry pistol for Eleanor. He had shown her how to use it, her hands trembling as she held the cold, heavy weapon. It felt alien, an instrument of death in hands that had only ever known embroidery needles and piano keys. They waited behind a jumble of rocks at a narrow point in the road, where a fallen cottonwood tree, dragged there by Jacob in the dead of night, blocked the path. The sound of the wagon wheels crunching on the gravel came first, a slow, rhythmic beat that echoed the frantic pounding of Eleanor's heart. The buckboard came into view, one guard driving, the other sitting in the back, his rifle held loosely across his lap. Between them sat Silas. He was manacled, his head bowed, his face bruised and swollen from the beating he had surely endured. The sight of him, so broken and defeated, extinguished the last of Eleanor's fear and left only the cold, hard flame of her rage. The driver pulled the wagon to a halt before the fallen tree. "What in blazes?" he grumbled. "Just pull it out of the way," the other guard said, already bored. As the driver climbed down, Jacob stepped out from behind the rocks, the shotgun leveled at his chest. "I would not," he said, his voice calm and steady as a rock. The guard in the back fumbled for his rifle, but he was too slow. A deafening roar shattered the morning quiet as Jacob fired one barrel, the buckshot tearing through the man's shoulder and sending him tumbling from the wagon with a scream of pain. In that same instant, Eleanor rose from her hiding place, the pistol held in both hands, and aimed it at the driver. "Do not move," she commanded, her voice shaking but clear. The driver, his face pale with shock, raised his hands. Silas's head had snapped up at the sound of the gunshot, and his eyes widened in stunned disbelief as he saw her. "Eleanor, no!" She ignored him, her entire focus on the task at hand. "The keys, Jacob," she said. The old man pulled a set of keys from the wounded guard's belt and tossed them to her. She scrambled into the back of the wagon, her fingers fumbling with the lock on Silas's manacles. They sprang open, and he was free. He immediately grabbed the fallen guard's rifle. "Get the horses unhitched," Silas commanded Jacob, his voice taking on an authority that had been absent moments before. He turned to Eleanor, his eyes blazing with a mixture of terror and adoration. "You are the most beautiful, foolish woman I have ever known." They fled, leaving the guards wounded and disarmed, and pushed their horses deep into the labyrinth of the desert canyons. They rode for hours, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and redemption. They knew Clayton would not be far behind. He would not send the law. This was personal now. He would send his own men, men who would not be bound by rules of arrest. For 2 days, they were hunted. They saw the dust of the posse on the horizon once, a grim promise of the pursuit to come. They survived on the little water they could carry and the sparse food Jacob had packed. Finally, exhausted and near the end of their endurance, they stumbled upon it. Serenity Gulch, an abandoned mining town, a collection of skeletal, sun-bleached shacks clinging to the side of a barren canyon. It was a ghost town, a place of forgotten dreams and failed ambitions. For them, it was a sanctuary. They chose the most solid of the buildings, a former assayer's office, and collapsed inside, the dust of decades puffing up around them. For days, they did nothing but heal. Eleanor tended to Silas's wounds, cleaning the cuts on his face and gently probing his bruised ribs. He, in turn, cared for her, his touch infinitely gentle as he applied a cool cloth to her bruised cheek. His eyes filled with a pain that was not his own. Jacob stood watch, a silent, tireless guardian, his shotgun never far from his hand. In the quiet of that ghost town, with the world held at bay, they talked for hours, for days, their stories spilling out in the cool darkness of the office. It was there that Silas finally told her everything. He spoke of his father's small ranch in the Northern Territory, a place of green grass and clear water. He spoke of Thaddeus Thorne, a cattle baron with an insatiable hunger for land, a man just like Clayton Gable. Thorne had wanted Silas's family land, the last piece that would connect his vast holdings. He had tried to buy it, then threatened them. When Silas's father refused to sell, Thorne began his campaign of ruin. He had Silas's fiancée, Sarah, whispered to, her head filled with lies about Silas, promises of a better, safer life in town. And then he had framed Silas for rustling, planting Thorne's own cattle on their land. "It was not just about the land," Silas said, his voice low and haunted as he stared into the darkness. "It was about breaking me. He wanted my home, he wanted my woman, and he wanted my spirit. He almost got all three." Eleanor listened, her heart aching for the young man he had been, the man whose life had been stolen by the greed of another. When he was finished, a heavy silence filled the room. "I am sorry, Eleanor," he whispered. "You tied your fate to a ruined man." She moved closer to him on the dusty floor, taking his hand in hers. His fingers were calloused and strong. "That man is a ghost," she said softly. "He does not exist anymore. I do not care who you were. Silas, I only know who you are now." She looked up, her eyes meeting his in the gloom. "I am in love with the man sitting in front of me." He searched her face, looking for any sign of doubt, of pity. He found none. He let out a ragged breath, a sound of profound, shuddering relief, and pulled her to him. In the ruins of that forgotten town, surrounded by the ghosts of other people's lives, they began to believe they could build a new one. Their fragile peace was shattered 3 days later. Jacob, perched on a rocky outcrop above the town, gave a low whistle, a glint of sunlight on a rifle barrel, miles down the canyon. The posse had found them. There were at least a dozen men, led by Boone, the man with the scarred eyebrow. "There is only one way out of this canyon," Jacob said, his face grim, "and they are at the mouth of it. We will have to fight our way through." It was a brutal, desperate plan. They took up positions among the rocks at the edge of the derelict town. The air grew still and hot, the silence broken only by the buzz of flies. Then came the thunder of hooves. The gunfight was a chaotic nightmare of noise and smoke and fear. Clayton's men, confident in their numbers, charged forward. Jacob, Silas, and Eleanor fired from the cover of the rocks. A rider screamed and fell, his horse tumbling after him. The others scattered, taking cover, and the real fight began. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks, whining like angry hornets. Jacob was a rock, a steady, unmovable force. He fired the shotgun with a calm, deadly efficiency, reloading with steady hands. "You two get to the horses," he yelled over the din. "I will hold them back." "We are not leaving you," Silas shouted back. "That is an order, son," Jacob roared. A lifetime of quiet deference burned away by the heat of battle. "I promised her mother I would see her safe. Now go!" He stood up from behind his cover, firing both barrels of the shotgun into the advancing men, buying them precious seconds. A rifle cracked from the opposite side of the canyon, and Jacob stiffened, a dark red stain blossoming on his chest. He staggered but did not fall. He turned to look at Eleanor, a faint, sad smile on his lips, before another bullet took him, and he crumpled to the ground. A raw, guttural cry of rage and grief tore from Eleanor's throat. She saw one of the men, Boone, rising from behind a rock, taking aim at Silas. Without thinking, without hesitating, she raised the heavy pistol, aimed, and fired. The gun kicked hard in her hands, the sound shockingly loud. Across the canyon, Boone grunted, a look of surprise on his face, before he pitched forward into the dust. She had killed a man. Her first kill. She felt nothing, no remorse, no horror, only a cold, clear certainty. This was survival. She had chosen it. A searing pain in Silas's side made him cry out. He stumbled, clutching at his ribs. "I am hit!" Eleanor scrambled to his side, tearing open his shirt. A bullet had grazed him, a deep, bloody furrow along his side. It was not fatal, but he was losing blood. They were out of time. She helped him to his feet, and they retreated to the horses, firing back as they went. They mounted up and rode hard, deeper into the canyon, the sounds of the gunfight fading behind them. They did not stop until nightfall, when they were sure they were no longer being followed. Eleanor gently cleaned and bound Silas's wound with strips torn from her petticoat. They were alive, but they had lost their only friend, and the chase was not over. For a week, they rode, their journey a blur of exhaustion, pain, and fear. They crossed the border of the territory, entering a new land where Clayton Gable's name meant less, but his money could still buy trackers and bounty hunters. Finally, on a high bluff overlooking a wide, slow-moving river, they saw it, a long, white-topped snake of a wagon train, heading west, It was a lifeline, a river of humanity flowing toward the promise of a new beginning. They watched it for a long time, the setting sun glinting off the canvas tops. "You should go," Silas said, his voice raspy and weak. "Join them. A woman alone. They will take you in. You can get to California, start over, find a new life, a safe life." Eleanor turned to look at him. His face was pale and drawn with pain, but his eyes were filled with a fierce, selfless love. He was willing to let her go, to face his own fate alone, if it meant she would be safe. She reached out and laid her hand on his cheek. "You are my life now. Silas," she said, her voice soft but unshakable. "We do not leave each other behind." The story of what happened at Serenity Gulch rode into redemption on the backs of Clayton Gable's defeated men. They returned not as a victorious posse, but as a ragged, grim-faced funeral procession. They carried their dead, including the man Boone, and brought with them a tale that spread through the town like a prairie fire in a high wind. The story was told in hushed, awe-filled tones in the saloon, whispered over the counters of the mercantile, and debated in the quiet parlors of the town's few respectable houses. Clayton Gable's bride, the delicate lady from Philadelphia, had not been a victim. She had been a warrior. They said she had fired a pistol with a steady hand, that she had fought like a cornered wolf to protect her outlaw lover. The narrative was intoxicating, a piece of raw, violent poetry in the drab prose of their everyday lives. And with every telling, the legend of Eleanor Vance grew. The town was split down the middle. There were those who were scandalized, who saw her as a Jezebel, a fallen woman who had abandoned her sacred vows and her powerful husband for a common drifter. They damned her name, clutching their Bibles and their propriety, seeing her defiance as a threat to the fragile order of their world. But there were others, more than a few, who spoke her name with a grudging, secret admiration. The ranch hands who had chafed under Gable's tyrannical rule, the shopkeepers squeezed by his ruthless business practices, the women who knew their own quiet, domestic prisons. They saw Eleanor not as a sinner, but as a symbol of rebellion. They did not say it aloud, not where Gable's spies could hear, but in their hearts. They cheered for her. Clayton felt the shift in the air. He was a man whose power was built on a foundation of absolute, unquestioned authority. And for the first time, that foundation was cracking. He was consumed by a black, impotent fury. He had been made a fool of, his property stolen, his authority challenged, his carefully constructed reputation poisoned. He drank heavily, his mood swinging from volcanic rage to sullen, paranoid silence. His men, the very instruments of his power, began to question him. They had signed on to work cattle, not to die in a personal feud over a woman. They saw the wild, obsessive look in his eyes and recognized it for what it was, the desperate rage of a king who feels his throne beginning to crumble. The fear he had once inspired was curdling into contempt. Miles away, in the relative safety of a new territory, Eleanor and Silas were making a decision. Silas's wound was healing, a livid red scar that was now a part of the violent tapestry of his skin. They had the wagon train in their sights, a tangible promise of a new life, of anonymity in the vast, sprawling West. "We could be in California in 3 months," Silas said one evening, his voice quiet as they watched the distant campfires of the pioneers. "Find a valley somewhere, a place where no one knows our names. I could work. We could be safe." Eleanor listened, picturing that life, a small cabin, a quiet existence. It was tempting. It was everything a sane person would choose. But as she looked back over her shoulder, in the direction of the life she had fled, she knew that safety was not the same as freedom. As long as Clayton Gable believed he owned her, as long as Silas Beckett was a wanted man, they would never be truly free. They would always be looking over their shoulders, living in the shadow of the past. "We are not going west," she said, her voice filled with a new, hard-won certainty. She held up the ledger, which she had protected through their entire ordeal. "This is our freedom. Silas, Not running, but fighting. We have to go back." He looked at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "Go back, Eleanor. He will kill us both without a second thought." "Not if we do not give him the chance to do it in the dark," she replied, her own plan, audacious and terrifying, forming in her mind. He is a bully and a coward. His power comes from secrets and fear. We are going to take both of those things away from him. We are going back to redemption, and we are going to face him, not as fugitives, but as accusers. For Jacob, for Jedediah Ames, for you, for me. He saw the unshakable resolve in her eyes, the strength that had been forged in the crucible of the last few weeks. The fearful, obedient girl he had met in a storm-tossed barn was gone forever. In her place was a woman of iron will, and he knew, in that moment, that he would follow her into the very fires of hell if she asked. "All right," he said, his voice a low, steady affirmation. "We go back." Their return to redemption was a spectacle. They did not sneak into town under the cover of darkness. They rode in at high noon, side by side, straight down the middle of the main street. Eleanor sat tall and straight in her saddle, her face pale but resolute, the fading bruise on her cheek a badge of defiance. Silas rode beside her, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol, his gaze sweeping the street, a silent, watchful protector. A hush fell over the town. People stopped in their tracks, their mouths agape. Shopkeepers came to their doorways. Patrons spilled out of the saloon. Women peered from behind their curtains. It was as if two ghosts had ridden back into the world of the living. The whispers started immediately, a wave of shock and disbelief that washed down the street ahead of them. They did not stop until they reached the small adobe church at the end of the town. They dismounted and waited. It did not take long. Word reached Clayton at the ranch, and he rode into town like a thundercloud. Flanked by the few men whose loyalty, or fear, he still commanded, he saw them standing there, in front of the one place that was supposed to represent a moral authority he had always disdained, and his face became a mask of pure, murderous rage. Sheriff Miller, alerted by the commotion, came hurrying out of his office, his face a jumble of confusion and alarm. Eleanor did not wait for Clayton to speak. She stepped forward, her voice ringing out in the unnatural quiet, clear and strong for all to hear. "Clayton Gable," she began, her eyes locked on his. "I am not your wife. I am your accuser." A collective gasp went through the crowd that had gathered. "You tried to have an innocent man, Silas Beckett, sent to prison on false charges," she continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "You are responsible for the death of your ranch hand, Jedediah Ames, and you are responsible for the death of a good and loyal man, Jacob Peters, who died protecting me from your hired guns." She turned to Sheriff Miller, who looked as if he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. "I have proof," she said, and she held up the ledger. "This is your husband's secret account book. Sheriff, it details the payment he made to have Jed Ames killed. It details years of his crimes, of extortion and bribery." She walked straight up to the sheriff and thrust the book into his hands. "I am placing this in your custody. I am formally accusing my husband of murder, and I expect you to do your duty." The sheriff stared at the ledger as if it were a venomous snake. He looked at Clayton, then at the 100 pairs of eyes that were now fixed upon him, waiting. "This is nonsense," Clayton roared, his voice hoarse with rage. "The woman is hysterical. She is a lying, adulterous whore." "Is she?" a voice called out from the crowd. An old, grizzled ranch hand, a man who had worked for Gable for 10 years, stepped forward. "I was there the night Jed Ames disappeared. I heard him arguing with the boss over a card game. I saw Gable's face. It was the face of a killer." Another voice joined in. "The livery owner. Those men Gable sent after his wife. They were not a posse. They were a lynch mob. He told them to bring Beckett back dead, and to bring the woman back any way they could. The dam of fear had broken, one by one. People who had been silenced for years by Clayton's power began to speak, their voices joining a chorus of accusation. The sheriff looked at the ledger, at the hostile faces in the crowd, and at Clayton, whose face was contorted in a mask of disbelief and fury. For the first time, Sheriff Miller saw that Clayton Gable's power was gone. Clayton saw it too. He saw the shift in the sheriff's eyes, the loss of deference, the dawning of resolve. He saw the contempt and hatred on the faces of the townspeople. He was cornered, his empire of fear collapsing around him. And in that moment, he reverted to the only law he had ever truly believed in, the law of violence. With a primal scream of rage, he drew his pistol. "If I am going to hang, I am taking him with me," he bellowed, leveling the gun at Silas. But before he could fire, the sheriff finally moved to action, lunged forward. Grabbing Clayton's arm, the gun went off, the bullet harmlessly plowing into the dust. Two deputies swarmed Clayton, wrestling the pistol from his grasp, forcing his arms behind his back. He struggled like a wild animal, his face purple with rage, but it was over. The law, his own corrupted tool, had finally turned on him. "Clayton Gable," the sheriff said, his voice grim as he snapped the cuffs on his wrists. "You are under arrest for murder." As they dragged him away, a trial now promised. The sheriff turned to Silas. "As for you, Beckett," he said, his voice holding a new note of respect, "it seems your name has been dragged through the mud in more than one territory, with these new witnesses. And what is in this book? I think we can petition the territorial governor. It will be a long road, but you have a chance to clear your name, for good." Silas looked at Eleanor, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw the ghost of the man he had once been, a man free from the weight of a past that was not his own making. He nodded at the sheriff. "I will take it," he said. Weeks later, Eleanor found herself stepping off a train in Philadelphia. The air was cool and damp, the sounds of the city a familiar, orderly cacophony after the vast silences of the West. She walked through the streets of her childhood, a stranger in her own past. The house she had grown up in had been sold, as she knew it would be. Her father was now living in a small, rented room in a boarding house. She found him there. He was older, smaller than she remembered, the swagger and bluster gone, replaced by the stooped shoulders of a defeated man. He looked at her, at his daughter who had returned from the wilderness, a completely different woman, and he could not find any words. Eleanor did not speak either. There was nothing left to say between them. She walked to the small table in the center of the room and opened the satchel she was carrying. She took out a heavy leather pouch and emptied its contents onto the table, a pile of silver dollars. The last of the dowry money she had insisted on taking from Clayton's safe, cascaded onto the wood. The sound a sharp, final punctuation to their relationship. It was not a gift. It was a reimbursement, the price of her freedom. She turned and walked out of the room without a backward glance, leaving her father standing there with the silver that had cost them both everything. She walked out of the boarding house, out of the city, and out of the life that had been chosen for her, and she never looked back. Months later, on the sun-scorched plains at the edge of a new town hundreds of miles from Redemption, a small sod house stood against the endless sky. The land was dry, the work was hard. Every day was a battle against the wind, the dust, and the unforgiving sun. But the life was honest. Silas worked for a local freight company, his name now legally his own again. Eleanor tended a small garden, coaxing life from the stubborn soil. They had little, but they had everything. They slept side by side each night on a simple straw mattress. The ghosts of their pasts were still there, lingering in the quiet moments before sleep. They were still haunted, still healing, but they were together. One evening, as the wind howled a lonely, mournful song across the open plains, Eleanor lay in the darkness, Listening to the steady rhythm of Silas's breathing beside her, she reached out, her hand finding his in the dark. She whispered into the silence, the words a final, quiet truth. It was not just one night. She felt his fingers tighten around hers. His voice, when he answered, was a low, steady rumble in the dark. I know. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this story. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect. Be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.